Flowers. Flowers are the reproductive structures of plants. In this diagram, you will need to know the male structure of the flower, which is called the stamen, and that consists of two parts, the anther and the filament, and then the female structure of the flower, which is the pistil or carpel. The pistil and carpel consists of three parts, the stigma, the style, and the ovary, and inside the ovary you have the ovules, which are the unfertilized seeds. To attract other animals to the flower, you have the petals. To protect the petals, you have the sepals, which actually form the outside of the flower, which is the bud. These are usually underneath the petals. Sometimes they are green, and sometimes, depending on the flower, they are the same color as the petals. The pedicle is considered the upper portion of the flower stem. The receptacle is the place where the stem holds the floral organs together. This is the upper portion of the stem where the stamen and ovary attach. The sepals are the green leaf-like structures underneath the petals. As I just said, many times they are green, sometimes they're the same color as petals. The sepals can be very colorful, looking like petals. The calyx is a group of sepals. Petals are located inside or above the sepals. They are very often leaf-like. The purpose is to attract pollinators, such as bees. The corolla are a collection of the petals, all the petals together. Tepals are a merging together of the petals and sepals. This is where there is no clear distinction between the sepal and the petal. The stamen is the male structure, and this is usually surrounding the female structure in a monoecious plant. The anther is part of the stamen that produces the pollen. This is usually at the very top or tip. The filament holds the anther. Then we move to the female part, the pistil or the carpel. The stigma is the top sticky part, sticky stigma, that catches the pollen. The style is the tube that the pollen has to travel down. The pollen will make a little pollen tube, and this is going to dig through the style, which is the neck of the pistil. And then we have the ovary. The ovary is at the very bottom. This is very close to the stem. This contains the ovules or the unfertilized seeds. The ovule, as I just said, produce the seeds. These are like the eggs. So the pollen is like the sperm, the male gamete. The ovule is the egg, the female gamete. When the ovule becomes fertilized, it produces a seed. The ovary will then swell, producing fruit. So the swollen ovary of a flower is called the fruit, and it produces a mass amount of food to nourish the seed. When the fruit hits the ground, it provides a fertilized ground for the seed to grow. In nature, the fruit is the flowering plant that usually contains the seeds. Now remember, fruit contains seeds. So scientifically, anything that is called a fruit comes from the flower and it has seeds. So we're not talking about a common cooking term, we're talking about a scientific term containing seeds. So what we commonly think of vegetables, because it's not sweet, those could actually be fruit. So cucumbers, squash, tomatoes, those all have seeds. So those are fruit. So if fruit are the enlarged ovaries containing seeds, then what are vegetables? Anything that would not be a fruit, anything that does not have a seed, anything that doesn't come from a flower would be a vegetable. So if we're talking about the leaf, such as lettuce, cabbage, if we're talking about stems, such as rhubarb or celery, if we're talking about the actual seed, which would be in the fruit, the actual seed, such as the little corn seed or the little bean seed, that would be a vegetable. And roots, such as carrots and radishes. Now, an onion actually would be considered an underground leaf because it has these layers of leaves folded on there. Underneath the onion, you do have little fibrous roots, identifying that it's a monocot. So here's a identification of all vegetables. Now, a potato is actually considered a tuber, which is an underground stem, a modified underground stem. It wouldn't be considered a root. Roots do come off of potatoes if you leave them in your pantry. Now we're going to focus on seeds. And in this section, we're going to be using a lot of terms, maybe some terms you remember from previous chapters, but you're going to be seeing a lot of terms here, and I'd highly encourage you to build on the previous terms by creating flashcards and keeping up with these and continue to study. So the first term we have is a seed. Now a seed is going to be referred to as a zygote or a diploid cell. Diploid meaning 2 or 2N. So the focus here is that we have a male gamete, which is in the human case a sperm. And animals have the male sperm, but in a plant that male gamete is called the pollen. Then we have another gamete, the female gamete, which in humans or animals is the egg, but in this case we call it an ovule. So the male gamete would be considered haploid or 1N. It's single, it cannot produce by itself. So in animals and humans, specifically humans, we have 23 chromosomes in the male gamete, 23 in the female. So they can't form a new person unless they come together, forming 46, right? So we say the male gamete is 1N or haploid. The female gamete is 1N or haploid. We put it together, they fertilize. So the pollen fertilizes the ovule. It now becomes a zygote. A new little baby can form. So the zygote is now a diploid. So 1 plus 1 is 2. So di meaning 2. Now once it develops and grows, that's going to be a term that we're going to talk about in a little bit. So that baby plant is called an embryo, and it's going to grow and develop through the process of germination or sprouting. So let's move into the term embryo. And embryo refers to the new baby plant after fertilization. So once we create the zygote, that baby starts growing. That's the embryo. So we're going to see the baby seed start developing and growing. So basically, a seed cannot just develop out of a flower. It needs that pollen to germinate it. Then we're going to move to a new term called the testa, and that's basically referring to the seed coat, the protective covering or outside of the seed. The endosperm is another name for the cotyledon or stored food, and you may see this term interchangeable with the cotyledon. Here's the cotyledon. Cotyledon primarily is the food source. In different resources, it's considered part of the leaf or an extension of the leaf or a leaf-like structure coming off of the stem. But when you eat a bean or a seed, that bulk of the bean or the seed is the food source. So like the peanut, that majority of what you're getting your food from when you boil a bean or eat a peanut, that's the cotyledon. And that's actually going to be what the little baby embryo, the baby plant, is going to be drawing food from to grow and develop. And if you ever saw a germinating plant, it starts to shrivel up. The cotyledon starts to shrivel up. Then we're going to move into the embryo, the baby plant, and we're going to focus on the plumule. Now the plumule is actually specifically the baby leaves. Now you may hear in some resources that the epicotyl is part of that. Yes, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but primarily plumule is the first leaves, the seed leaves. The epicotyl is the upper portion connecting to the seed leaves. So some resources may consider the epicotyl, epi meaning on top, consider that and including the plumule. So it may say the epicotyl is the upper portion and the seed leaves. Yes, but other resources may just say no, the plumule is separate from the epicotyl. So be aware that there's some overlap in different resources. Then we have the hypocotyl. Hypo meaning below. So this is actually the stem-like structure that is below the leaves. This is closer to the cotyledon. This is majority of the stem. Then we have the radicle, R for baby root. So as the root develops, the first or primary root is the radicle. Then we have some new terms, dormancy, viability, and germination. You may recognize these from just everyday speech. Dormancy referring to hibernation. So this is basically if there's no oxygen, no warmth, or no water available. A seed needs all three of those to develop. So if those three things are not there, basically a seed is going to stay dormant. It's not going to grow and develop. It's going to stay in this hibernation period. And you can store seeds, and they can survive without those three things, but they can't develop and germinate until they have those. Now, we have seed viability. Seed viability is just saying that if we do have those necessary conditions, we can develop and grow. That plant, that baby seed, can now germinate. So germination means breaking of the dormancy, breaking of the hibernation, because it has oxygen, warmth, and water. How can I forget water? So basically it has all those three important things, water, oxygen, and warmth. Now it is viable. It is meeting all the conditions, so now it can grow. So germination refers to the sprouting or the growing of the seed. Okay, here you can actually see in the upper right corner, there's the testa or seed coat, and then we have something called the hilum, which is the seed scar. There's a microphyll little area that where the pollen will come in this little area. Also, this is like an activation area where it'll trigger germination if water gets in that area as well. This is going to be something that we're going to talk about briefly, but you can really see that in bean seeds, that little hilum or seed scar area. We can also see in this little step-by-step process of germination, you can see the cotyledons, those two little food sources coming up, and they start to separate. Then you have the first leaves coming out amongst the cotyledon, and then the cotyledon kind of stays kind of in the middle as the first leaves in upper portion, the plumal and the epicotyl, start rising above the cotyledon. Now the cotyledon now is kind of in the middle, while the hypocotyl now in this instance is below the cotyledon. Now you can take a look at the comparison between the monocot and dicot seed. The monocot having one cotyledon or one food source, while the dicot separates and has two cotyledons or two food sources. It also has two seed leaves. So you can actually see the endosperm, the seed coat, and the embryo on the corn seed or the monocot seed. You can actually see there's a lot more description in the dicot seed. So I'm going to have you label those. You can see the testa is the covering or seed coat. We're not going to talk about the tegment. Then we have for the embryo, we have the plumal, epicotyl, hypocotyl, radicle, and cotyledon. And then at the bottom we have the hilum, which we just talked about. So we have the cotyledon, or that endosperm containing that food storage. So you're going to use this diagram to label your seeds and be responsible for that content. Here's the dicot germination, just like we saw on the germinating slide. Here are the structures labeled again. You can see the hypocotyl as the plant rises up is now going to be below the cotyledon. Hypo meaning below. Epicotyl above, and you can see the epicotyl is the upper portion, very close to the first leaves or the plumule. Now we're going to focus on seed dispersal. Seed dispersal basically just talks about how seeds are going to be dispersed or moving from point A to point B, maybe from the fruit to maybe a different area. Sometimes fruit will fall, and it provides this good fertilizer, and basically right where the fruit breaks down and disintegrates, that's where the seed in the plant is going to grow. There could be other cases in which animals will eat it and then later on poop out or excrete the seed. But we have here by wind and water, you can see the dandelion. Actually, that's a dandelion fruit. The little fluffy area, the long extension, is part of the fruit, while the very bottom area is actually considered the seed. So wind is going to send out the dandelion seed, maybe the maple fruit. You can see the little bumps there are the actual seeds. And then you have the coconut. The coconut primarily is going to be transported by water, so we have wind and water transporting these seeds. As we said, animals are going to perhaps eat, maybe insects carry them off, but the most common one is by stickers, little hooks, or this little fuzz that animals might walk by, maybe a cat, dog, an animal that has longer fur, basically may carry that little seed from the original point to a very long distance until it falls off or gets scratched off. Cannot germinate until after they've been eaten. So as we see with the squirrel, a squirrel will maybe break open the outside part of the fruit, and like the walnut is a fruit and then a dry fruit, and then bury it. Now, maybe bury the seed. Well, they don't know the little squirrel is inadvertently planting, a tree or a plant when they do that. But a lot of times, seeds can't germinate unless something very toxic or high acidity or something very strong, maybe even fire, breaks that outer covering. So some plants can't, some seeds can't germinate unless a bird eats it, and then its digestive enzymes, the acid in its stomach, breaks the outside shell. Then when it's excreted and pooped out, then it lands and it can actually grow. But it wouldn't be able to do that without the animal eating it. So that's in certain types of seeds. And then some seeds can't germinate unless fire. If you think about a forest fire, it's really terrible. It's so much death that can occur from that, but there's also new life that can grow, that a lot of trees and a lot of plants, some of these seeds cannot develop unless a fire breaks that outer covering, allowing it to grow after the fire is done.